No one sat in Dante Rossi's chair. Not the underbosses who had built their reputations on blood and loyalty across 3 generations of organized crime. Not the capos who commanded armies of soldiers across 5 states. Men who would kill without hesitation and die without complaint. Not even the cleaning crew when they polished the mahogany desk at 3 in the morning, wiping away the ghosts of meetings that had decided fates, fortunes, and sometimes lives. The chair was sacred, untouchable. It belonged to the man who had controlled the Rossi syndicate and half the eastern seaboard shadow economy for 11 years without raising his voice above a murmur, without showing weakness, without ever once submitting to the pull of his own biology. That morning, Julian Cross sat in it. He crossed one ankle over the other knee, pitched his voice low, and fixed his gaze on a terrified junior analyst standing frozen before the desk. The financial report arrived 47 minutes late, Julian said, copying Dante's glacial precision with unsettling accuracy. Clearly, the entire analytics department must be restructured, starting with whoever decided punctuation was optional. We'll begin with a mandatory seminar on the proper use of the semicolon. Attendance is not optional. Neither is survival. 3 assistants near the door pressed their fists to their mouths to stifle their reactions. One of them was actually crying, but they were tears of suppressed laughter, not fear. Julian lifted Dante's fountain pen, a vintage Montegrappa that had probably signed more death warrants than contracts, the gold nib gleaming under the soft office light, and pointed it toward the desk lamp. And this lamp, it's been leaning 3 degrees to the left for 2 weeks. Disloyalty begins with small deviations. Everyone knows that. First the lamp leans, then the stapler rebels, then the entire building defects to the rival family. It's a slippery slope. Someone wheezed. Someone else made a sound like a choked sob. Julian grew bolder. He turned toward the analyst, whose hands were shaking so badly he'd nearly deleted the entire quarterly forecast the night before. The poor man looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under his eyes, his shirt untucked, his scent sour with fear. Your decimal error cost the company exactly $14.82. Naturally, I will now stare at you until your ancestors rise from the grave to issue a formal apology. I expect handwritten apologies on parchment. Your great-grandmother's handwriting was famously impeccable, and I will accept nothing less. She was a woman of principle, as I understand it, and her cursive was legendary. The office finally broke. Quiet laughter rippled between cubicles, spreading like a virus no one could contain. It started with the assistants near the door, then moved to the accounting team, then to the security guards who had been pretending not to listen. For the first time that morning, the terrified analyst cracked a smile, tentative, disbelieving, but real. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing steadied. The fear that had been consuming him drained away, replaced by something lighter. Then every sound stopped. Dante Rossi stood behind Julian. His black coat still carried the chill of the October rain, droplets beating on the shoulders like tiny diamonds. His dark hair was slightly damp, slicked back from his face in the precise style he'd worn for as long as anyone could remember. 2 guards waited several steps behind him, both wearing expressions usually reserved for funerals and executions. They looked like they were preparing to witness something terrible. The scent hit Julian a second later. Dark cedar, gunpowder, and something impossibly warm beneath it all. An alpha's scent. Dante's scent. The kind that made omegas in a 50-foot radius instinctively lower their gazes, their bodies responding before their minds could catch up. The kind that made other alphas submit without thinking. The kind that had brought empires to their knees and kept them there. Julian slowly placed the pen on the desk. He turned in Dante's chair and looked up at him. No one in the office moved. No one breathed. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Before we continue, Julian said, his voice steady despite the way his heart had relocated to his throat. Tell me which city you're watching from. If you accidentally mock the most feared don in the organization from his own chair, do you apologize, or do you claim the chair forced you into a life of crime? I'm asking for professional development purposes. I want to make sure my performance review is accurate." Julian rose. He expected Dante to dismiss him immediately, to have him escorted out, possibly to a location that didn't appear on any map. He'd heard stories, whispers in the hallways about what happened to people who crossed Dante Rossi, who forgot their place, who treated the Don's authority as a joke. The rumors were probably exaggerated. Probably. Instead, Dante's gaze moved from the leaning lamp to the analyst, then back to Julian. His dark eyes, the color of espresso and old secrets, flecked with gold in certain lights, held something Julian had never seen in 11 months of working as his executive secretary. Something like warmth. Something like surprise. Something like a door opening. "Did you just accuse my furniture of conspiracy?" Dante's voice was low, almost thoughtful, like he was genuinely considering the question. Julian considered lying. Unfortunately, 12 witnesses were watching, and the lamp did look guilty. Its shade was practically askew with suspicion. The bulb was probably plotting something. The entire desk was probably in on it. A sound escaped Dante. It was quiet at first, almost like a breath he'd failed to control. Then his shoulders moved, once, twice, and the sound became something else. Something that made the guards exchange glances of pure bewilderment. Something that made the assistants near the door forget how to breathe. Something that made Julian's heart stutter in his chest. Dante Rossi was laughing. It wasn't a loud laugh. Dante Rossi would never do anything so undignified. It was a low, surprised sound, like the universe had caught him off guard, and he was still deciding whether to be annoyed about it. His lips curved upward, the corners of his eyes crinkling, and for one breathtaking moment, he looked almost young, almost free, almost like the man he might have been if tragedy hadn't claimed him, almost like a different person entirely. The entire office froze more completely than before. One guard looked toward the other, silently asking whether they should call a doctor, or a priest, or possibly an exorcist. The other guard shrugged helplessly, equally lost. Dante placed one hand against the desk, his shoulders shaking before he forced the sound down. His scent flared, warm, almost startled, like a fire suddenly catching oxygen after years of smoldering unseen. The scent of an alpha experiencing genuine joy for the first time in over a decade. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Julian had worked as his executive secretary for 11 months. He'd seen Dante angry, the kind of quiet, devastating anger that made grown men weep, that emptied rooms faster than a bomb threat, that left people trembling for days afterward. He'd seen Dante exhausted, hollow-eyed after 3 nights without sleep following a territory dispute that had left 3 of his men dead. He'd seen Dante silent enough to terrify a room full of killers, the kind of silence that pressed down on you like a physical weight, that made you confess to crimes you hadn't committed just to make it stop. He had never seen Dante amused. Neither had anyone else. For 11 years, Dante Rossi had not laughed. Not since the night his younger brother, Enzo, had died in a car bomb meant for him. The humor vanished from Dante's face almost immediately. Something darker replaced it. Grief, guilt, the familiar weight of survival that Julian had glimpsed in his eyes on bad days. He looked toward the empty chair as though the laughter had betrayed him more deeply than Julian's imitation ever could. The shadows in his eyes deepened. The lines around his mouth tightened. The door he'd just opened slammed shut again. Then he ordered everyone back to work. The words were quiet, almost gentle, that made them more terrifying than any shout. People scattered like leaves in a storm, grabbing papers and laptops and fleeing to their cubicles. Julian expected him to leave. Instead, Dante told him to follow into the private office. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded louder than a gunshot. Dante stood near the window, watching rain strike the glass like tiny accusations. His back was to Julian, his shoulders rigid, his hands clasped behind him in a posture that was probably meant to look composed, and instead looked like he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. His scent was turbulent, grief and anger, and something fragile that Julian couldn't quite identify. something that smelled almost like fear. Julian remained beside the door, his notebook pressed against his chest like a shield. His scent, honey and vanilla, usually soft and unobtrusive, had gone sharp with anxiety. He could smell it himself, which meant Dante could certainly smell it, which meant the Don probably thought Julian was about to faint or cry, or do something equally humiliating. He wasn't going to do any of those things. He was going to apologize and accept his fate with dignity. "I apologize," Julian said carefully, "for sitting in your chair, touching your pen, turning your management style into office entertainment. I understand if you need to. Why did you do it?" The question cut through Julian's prepared speech. Julian hesitated. "Daniel, the junior analyst. He made a harmless mistake, and he genuinely believed you would destroy his career. He was panicking, hyperventilating. I needed to distract him before he gave himself a heart attack. He was in no state to work, and he certainly wasn't in any state to face you. He looked like he was about to pass out. So you mocked me. I distracted him. You called my lamp disloyal. It was the strongest part of the performance. The lamp was very cooperative. It knew what it had to do. I think it enjoyed itself." Dante almost smiled again. Julian saw it. The brief twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his eyes softened for half a second before he stopped himself. Then his expression shuddered, and Julian understood that whatever had just happened was more complicated than simple amusement. The room contained no personal photographs except one silver frame facing the window. It showed a younger Dante beside a grinning young man who shared his dark eyes, but none of his severity. The brother, Julian assumed. The one no one ever spoke about. The one whose name was never mentioned in meetings, whose absence filled every room Dante entered. The ghost that haunted the Rossi organization. The hole in Dante's heart. Dante noticed him looking. "My brother, Enzo." The name changed the room. It was as if Dante had opened a door that had been sealed for years, and all the grief came pouring out, flooding the space between them. 11 years ago, Dante said, and his voice was different now. Raw, stripped of the command he wore like armor. "Enzo died during an attack meant for me. He was 26. Loud. Reckless. The only person in the family who could mock me without fear." He paused, his jaw tightening. "He used to sit in my chair, copy my voice, declare ordinary objects enemies of the family. The lamp, the stapler, the particularly suspicious paperweight. He once spent an entire meeting accusing the water cooler of being a federal informant. He had everyone convinced for about 10 minutes. The security team actually searched it. They took it apart in the middle of a strategy session." Julian's imitation had sounded painfully familiar. He hadn't made Dante laugh because he was unusually funny. For one careless second, he had returned Enzo to the room. He had opened a door he hadn't known existed. "Your brother sounds like he was wonderful," Julian said quietly. Dante's jaw tightened. He was unbearable. "You miss him every day." The words hung between them. Julian hadn't meant to say them out loud. They'd just slipped out, the way truth sometimes did when he stopped guarding his tongue. He watched Dante's expression shift, the careful walls cracking just slightly, the grief seeping through like light through a broken window. "How would you know?" Dante asked. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. Like he'd never considered that anyone else could understand. Like he'd been alone with his grief for so long that the idea of shared experience was foreign. Julian looked down at his notebook. The leather cover was worn, the pages filled with his cramped handwriting, schedules, notes, observations that had helped him survive in this world of alphas and violence and unspoken rules. "Because I know what it's like to lose someone and feel like happiness is a betrayal," Julian said. "My mother. She died when I was 17. Cancer. And for years afterward, every time I laughed, I felt like I was forgetting her. Like being okay meant I hadn't loved her enough." He paused, swallowed. "I used to dream about her. And in the dreams, she'd be disappointed in me. For moving on. For not grieving hard enough. For daring to be happy when she couldn't be. I'd wake up feeling guilty." Dante studied him for a long moment. His scent shifted, the sharp edge of grief softening into something warmer, something almost like recognition. I've had those dreams too, he admitted. Enzo shows up, and he's laughing at something, and I'm so happy to see him. And then I wake up, and I remember, he stopped. I wish I could forget. No, Julian said softly. You don't. You wish it hurt less. But you don't wish to forget. How do you know? Because forgetting would mean he never existed. And he existed. He still exists, in your memory, in everything he left behind, in the way you talk about him, in the way you've kept his office exactly as it was, in the way you still think about him every single day. Dante's eyes were bright. Not with tears. Dante Rossi would never cry in front of anyone, especially not his Omega secretary, but with something close. Something that made Julian's chest ache. 11 years, Dante said. I haven't laughed since Enzo died. Every time I feel anything close to joy, I hear his voice in my head, and I remember, he stopped. Swallowed. I remember he died because of me. Because he switched cars with me at the last minute. Because I let him. Because I was too slow, too stupid, too weak to stop him. Because I wasn't paying attention. Let him. Julian's voice was gentle. Or because he loved you and made a choice? Dante's eyes flashed. You don't know what you're talking about. No, I don't. Julian met his gaze steadily. But I know that grief has a cruel habit of turning every good feeling into betrayal. And I know that your brother probably didn't save you, so you could spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for surviving. He didn't die, so you could stop living. He died so you could keep living. The silence that followed was different from the ones Julian had grown accustomed to. Softer. Almost like breathing room. Like the air in the room had shifted, become less heavy, less charged with pain. Then the intercom activated. Marco Vitali, Dante's senior advisor, announced that an emergency order had been sent to close one of the organization's warehouses and terminate 42 employees. His voice was smooth, professional, but Julian caught something beneath it. A thread of satisfaction that didn't belong. A note of triumph. Dante turned sharply. I issued no such order. Julian was already moving. He pulled up the scheduling file on his tablet, cross-referencing approval times against Dante's calendar. The document carried Dante's name, his digital signature, and instructions supposedly dictated during a meeting that had never taken place. The timestamps were wrong. The formatting was wrong. The entire thing screamed forgery. This isn't the first mismatch I've noticed, Julian said quietly. It's just the first time I've been brave enough to mention it. Dante read the order twice. Then he looked at Julian, the Omega who had just made him laugh after 11 years, who had touched his grief without flinching, who had uncovered a command issued under his identity. Something shifted in his expression. Respect. Trust. Something warmer. Something that made Julian's breath catch. Close the door, Dante said. This time, Julian knew he wasn't planning to fire him. Someone inside the Rossi organization had been speaking with Dante's voice, and Julian might be the only person organized enough to prove it. Dante canceled the warehouse closure before 42 employees lost their jobs. Then he asked Julian to collect every instruction issued under his name during the previous year. No one outside the private office knew why. They only knew that Dante Rossi had laughed for the first time in 11 years, and the secretary responsible was still breathing. By lunchtime, rumors had spread through all 6 floors like wildfire. Some employees believed Julian had become Dante's closest confidant, the Omega who had somehow cracked the Don's armor. Others claimed he possessed dangerous information, evidence that could bring down half the organization's leadership. A few whispered that the Omega had somehow, impossibly, seduced the Don, using his biology to gain influence over a man who had never shown interest in anyone before. The gossip was relentless, speculative, and mostly wrong. Daniel, the junior analyst Julian had protected, quietly placed a coffee on Julian's desk with a note. Thank you for saving my job and surviving the chair. Also, please don't ever do that again. I'm too young to attend your funeral. I have student loans. Also, I have a cat. He needs me. Also, I'm pretty sure I'd cry at your funeral, and that would be embarrassing for everyone. Julian smiled and returned to the files. The forged warehouse order wasn't isolated. He found canceled medical benefits Dante had never approved. Vendors removed without meetings. Employees transferred after questioning unusual expenses. Every instruction carried Dante's authorization code. But Julian managed Dante's calendar. He knew exactly where the Don had been when each supposed decision was made. One order had been approved while Dante was attending a memorial service for a fallen capo. Another claimed he dictated instructions during a transatlantic flight when his phone had been locked inside the aircraft safe. A third had been issued at 3:47 a.m. on a night when Dante had been in surgery, the result of a shooting that had nearly killed him. Someone was using his reputation to ensure no one asked questions. Someone who had access to his schedules, his codes, his habits. Julian had a suspicion about who. He needed proof. Marco Vitali entered Julian's office without knocking. He had advised the Rossi family for nearly 18 years and wore loyalty like part of his expensive suit. His suits were always impeccable. Armani, custom-tailored, the kind of quality that announced wealth without shouting. His smile was always warm, his handshakes firm, his advice always seemingly sound. He was the kind of man who made you trust him before you even knew you were being manipulated. He was also an alpha, one of the few in the organization who didn't seem affected by Dante's presence, which Julian had always found suspicious. Most alphas deferred to Dante instinctively, their biology demanding submission to a stronger alpha. Marco didn't. He met Dante's eyes without flinching. He offered opinions without being asked. He acted like an equal rather than a subordinate. The way he carried himself suggested he thought he was the real power behind the throne. Julian. Marco's smile was warm, but his scent was all wrong, sharp and assessing, like a predator evaluating prey. I hear you've been requesting archived records outside your authority. Dante authorized the review, Julian said calmly. He kept his hands steady on the keyboard, his expression neutral. He wasn't going to let Marco see how much this confrontation unnerved him. Did he? Marco's smile didn't waver. How fortunate for you. Making the Don laugh has clearly confused you about your position. Secretaries manage calendars. They don't investigate executive decisions. They take notes and make coffee and stay in their lane. Julian closed the folder in front of him. Then it's fortunate I'm checking calendars. The calendars have been telling me some very interesting things. Marco's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Be careful, Julian. Dante's grief has made him vulnerable to people who offer comfort at the right moment. People who might have ulterior motives. People who might be trying to take advantage of his pain. The accusation was clear. Julian understood. Marco wanted him to believe Dante's laughter had made him dangerous. That the Don's interest was merely weakness. That an Omega couldn't possibly have earned trust on his own merits. That the only way Julian could have gained influence was through manipulation. Thank you for the advice, Julian said. I'll file it appropriately. Marco's eyes narrowed, but he left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and Julian released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were shaking slightly. His scent was spiking with anxiety. He took a moment to compose himself, then recorded the time of Marco's visit in his notes. Organization wasn't dramatic. It was often how quiet people survived powerful ones. And Julian had been surviving his whole life. That afternoon, Dante called the warehouse supervisor directly. The man initially struggled to speak, convinced he was about to be punished. His voice cracked over the phone, his words tumbling out in a rush of explanations and apologies that Dante cut through with a single question. Did I issue that order? The supervisor went silent. No, sir. But it had your name on it. Your code. I thought. You thought I had changed my mind without telling you. Yes, sir. Tell me what happened. Everything. Leave nothing out. The supervisor revealed that Marco's office had pressured him for months to use a more expensive transport company. When he refused, citing budget concerns and loyalty to the Rossi organization, the closure order appeared the next day. The message was unmistakable. Cooperate or lose everything. 42 families, the supervisor whispered. 42 employees. Some of them have been here for 20 years. I didn't want to let them go, but I didn't think I had a choice. Your name was on it. I thought you changed. I thought you decided we were disposable. Dante looked toward Julian, who was listening silently. Julian didn't celebrate being correct. He didn't look triumphant. He looked sad. 42 families had nearly lost their income because everyone feared confirming one command. Because Dante's silence had become a weapon that other people could use. Because fear had replaced trust. Dante's expression shifted. Something like regret flickered in his eyes. Something like shame. He ordered a company-wide policy. No major dismissal, closure, or transfer would be valid without direct confirmation from his office and a second executive signature. Marco objected immediately, claimed the change would make Dante appear uncertain, that it would damage his reputation, that it would create unnecessary bureaucracy, that it would show weakness to their enemies. Dante's response was quiet. Correcting a weakness is an uncertainty. Allowing someone else to speak with my voice is. Julian watched the exchange with careful attention. Something was shifting in the organization structure, and Marco knew it. The senior advisor's scent had gone from sharp to sour, the unmistakable acridity of an alpha whose control was slipping. His smiles were becoming more forced, his advice more pointed. He was starting to look like a man who realized he was about to be caught. That evening, Julian remained late, comparing approval times against Dante's calendar. The office was quiet. Most employees had gone home, leaving the fluorescent lights humming over empty cubicles. The building had a different feel at night, less threatening, more peaceful. Julian sat at his desk, surrounded by files and printouts, his eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets for hours. He was so focused on the work that he didn't notice the scent until it was right behind him. Dark cedar and warmth. Dante's scent, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Julian startled. Mr. Rossi. Dante, the Don corrected. He set one of the cups on Julian's desk. We're past formalities, I think. After everything that's happened today, I think you can call me by my name. Julian looked at the coffee suspiciously. Did you make this? No. I had someone else do it. Good. I'm not ready to die for company loyalty. I'd like to at least finish this investigation first. Dante almost laughed again. This time, he didn't stop the smile entirely. It was small, barely there, but it transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. The lines around his eyes softened. The tension in his jaw eased. Julian noticed that the moment still brought guilt into his eyes, but it no longer completely erased the warmth. The guilt was still there, but it was quieter now, more manageable. Enzo used to mock my coffee, Dante said, settling into the chair across from Julian's desk. He said I drank it without sugar. According to him, bitterness should never be a personality and a beverage at the same time. He said life was already bitter enough without making it worse. Julian smiled. He sounds like he was sensible. He was unbearable. But Dante's voice was softer now. Fond. I miss him every day. For years, Julian added quietly. Dante looked at him sharply, then sighed. For years. And he stopped. I've never said that out loud before. Not to anyone. Not to Marco. Not to my father's old advisors. Not to anyone. I've kept it all locked up. Julian didn't offer a lesson about grief. He continued arranging documents into piles and allowed Dante to speak when he was ready. That was something Julian had learned over the years. People needed space to talk, not advice on how to feel. They needed someone to listen, not someone to fix things. How did you survive? Dante finally asked. After your mother. How did you, he gestured vaguely, keep going? How did you keep laughing? By refusing to let grief become the only thing I was, Julian said. I worked 2 jobs. I made terrible jokes. I told myself that being okay didn't mean I'd stopped loving her. It just meant I was still alive, and alive people have to keep living. You can't stop living just because someone else did. Dante absorbed this in silence. His scent was warm, contemplative. Your father's printing shop, he said after a moment. The one you mentioned once. What happened to it? Julian blinked. You remember that? I remember everything about you, Julian. The words landed somewhere in Julian's chest and stayed there, warm and disconcerting. He looked down at his files to hide his expression, but he could feel his cheeks flushing. It was ridiculous. He was a grown man, a professional, and Dante Rossi was making him blush like a teenager. It survived for 30 years, Julian said. Then poor contracts and rising debts nearly closed it. I worked several jobs to help, but I refused to ask for money from anyone because I wanted employment, not rescue. I didn't want to be anyone's charity case. Admirable, Dante said. And foolish. I prefer principled. Dante smiled again, a real smile this time, though it faded quickly. What do you want from your career, Julian? Julian considered the question. I want to solve problems before executives turn them into emergencies. He glanced at the files surrounding him. I want to be the person who sees what everyone else misses. I want to be useful. I want to make a difference. You appear qualified. It wasn't a promotion, but it was the first time Dante had looked beyond the word secretary, and Julian found that it mattered more than he'd expected. Near midnight, Julian discovered that most forged orders had been created from the same executive terminal. The terminal belonged to Marco's private office. Julian's heart rate accelerated. He printed the access history, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The evidence was conclusive: timestamps, user logs, everything he needed to prove what he'd suspected for weeks. He had Marco. He had him cold. He went to inform Dante. Dante's office was empty. On his desk lay a new document carrying his digital approval. Julian Cross, immediate dismissal. The order would activate at 8 the following morning. At the bottom, Marco had added a reason: emotional manipulation of executive leadership. Omega leveraging biological advantage to influence Don's decisions. Inappropriate relationship with superior. Use of heat cycle to gain favor. Julian felt his blood run cold. His scent, honey and vanilla, usually soft and unobtrusive, spiked with fear. It was the scent that gave Omegas away, that marked them as vulnerable, that made alphas instinctively want to protect or dominate. It was the scent that had been used against Omegas for centuries, that had been weaponized and manipulated and shamed. He couldn't afford to be vulnerable right now. He needed to be strong. He needed to be the person Dante trusted. The private elevator opened behind him. Marco stepped into the office, looking at the dismissal order, then at the evidence in Julian's hands. His scent was aggressive now. Pine and ozone. The unmistakable signature of an alpha preparing to attack. His posture was dominant, his shoulders back, his chin raised. He was ready to fight. You should have remained behind your desk, Marco said. You should have stayed in your place. I did. Julian tightened his grip on the files. That's where I found you. Marco stood between Julian and the private elevator. The dismissal order remained on Dante's desk, carrying an approval code Julian already knew was false. The senior advisor extended one hand toward the access report. Taking confidential records from an executive terminal could lead to more than dismissal, Marco said smoothly. It could lead to charges of industrial espionage, theft, possibly something worse. Something that could land you in a federal prison. Julian kept the papers against his chest. You created an order to fire me from Dante's office while he wasn't here. Marco smiled calmly. Dante has become emotionally unstable since laughing in front of the staff. Your presence is distracting him from decisions that require discipline. His eyes flicked down Julian's body, assessing. You're an Omega, Julian. Pretty. Clever. Easy to manipulate. It's understandable that you'd use every tool at your disposal, but it's also predictable. You're not special. You're just another Omega using what nature gave you. Julian understood what Marco was doing. If he became frightened or angry, the advisor would use his reaction as proof that he was manipulative. If he submitted, if he showed the deference Omegas were expected to show, Marco would claim he'd admitted guilt. If he cried or begged, Marco would use that too. There was no winning with someone like Marco. So Julian did something unexpected. He stepped toward Dante's desk, picked up the phone, and pressed one button. The call connected to the conference room upstairs. Mr. Rossi, Julian said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Marco is inside your office. There's a forged dismissal order on your desk with my name on it. And I have proof that the forged orders we've been investigating originated from Marco's terminal. I have the access logs. I have everything. Marco's smile disappeared. Dante arrived less than a minute later. He was still wearing the dark suit from dinner, his hair slightly disheveled, his scent flaring with barely contained anger. He looked at Julian first, checking for injury, for distress, for signs of harm. Then his gaze moved to Marco. His eyes went cold. Explain. Marco straightened his tie. The executive system generated the order after several department heads complained about Mr. Cross's influence. He's been overstepping his authority, using his proximity to you two. Names, Dante interrupted. I want the names of every department head who complained. Every single one. Marco's mouth opened and closed. No names emerged. Julian placed the terminal access report on the desk. Every forged instruction originated from Marco's office. I have the access logs. I have the timestamps. I have the records of every document sent under your authorization when you were physically elsewhere. I've cross-referenced everything. Dante studied the evidence. His expression was unreadable. Then he looked at Marco with something approaching disappointment. Marco, you've been with my family for 18 years. You came to my father's funeral. You helped me navigate the transition when I took over. You were there for me when Enzo died. Tell me why. Marco's composure cracked. Because you were weak, Dante. After Enzo died, you stopped being the man you were. You became, he gestured angrily. You became someone who could be led, who could be managed. I didn't take anything you weren't willing to give up. You gave it up piece by piece, and I collected the pieces. I gave up nothing. You stole. I protected you. Marco's voice rose. I made decisions you couldn't make. I kept the organization running while you drowned in grief. And this, he pointed at Julian. This Omega waltzes in, makes you laugh, and suddenly you're reversing orders, questioning loyalty, tearing down everything I built. Everything I sacrificed for. Everything you built, Dante repeated slowly. Everything you built from the wreckage of my brother's death. Marco's face went white. Get out, Dante said. I'll deal with you later. But get out of my sight before I do something we'll both regret. Marco left. His scent lingered, bitter and defeated. The door closed. Julian stood frozen, his heart still pounding. He could feel the aftershocks of adrenaline in his system, the way his body was processing the confrontation. His scent was all over the place, spicy with fear, sweet with something else he didn't want to examine too closely. Dante turned to him. Are you all right? I'm fine. You're shaking. Julian looked down at his hands. He was. Fear doesn't mean Marco was right, he said. Fear just means I have a healthy sense of self-preservation. Dante moved closer. His scent shifted, the sharp edge of anger softening into something protective, almost tender. An alpha's instinct to comfort. Julian knew it well, had been subjected to it his whole life by well-meaning relatives and less well-meaning bosses. He tensed. Dante stopped immediately. I'm not going to do anything you don't want. I promise. I know. Julian took a breath. He shook his head. I don't want to be comforted because I'm an Omega. I want to be trusted because I'm competent. I want to be seen as an equal, not as something that needs protecting. I've spent my whole life being protected, and it's never helped me. Dante studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Fair enough. He stepped back, giving Julian room to breathe. The gesture was surprisingly thoughtful. Julian wondered if Dante had always been this careful, or if the man was learning to see him, learning to treat him differently, learning that Julian wasn't like other Omegas. You should go home, Dante said. It's late, and tomorrow will be complicated. What about Marco? I'll handle it. Dante. Julian's voice was firm. I know you want to protect me. I know that's what alphas do. But I'm not asking to be protected. I'm asking to be useful. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem that needs solving. Dante's expression shifted. Something like respect flickered in his dark eyes. You're not a problem, Julian. You've never been a problem. The words settled between them, weighted with meaning Julian wasn't ready to examine. He looked away. Then I'll see you tomorrow, he said. And we'll figure out what to do about Marco. Julian didn't sleep well that night. He lay in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation over and over. Marco's accusations. Dante's protectiveness. The way Dante's scent had flared when Marco had called Julian a distraction. The way Dante had looked at him, like he was something precious, something worth protecting. He'd worked for Dante for 11 months. 11 months of careful professionalism, of keeping his head down, of making sure no one noticed the Omega in their midst. He'd built walls around himself so high that no one could see over them. He'd perfected the art of being invisible, of being efficient, of being exactly what people expected. Dante had climbed his walls anyway. It was terrifying. Julian had never let himself want anything from an alpha. He'd seen what happened to Omegas who wanted, who trusted, who let themselves be vulnerable. His mother had been one of them, and she'd ended up alone, raising Julian by herself, working herself to the bone to provide a life they could barely afford. She'd loved an alpha who had promised her everything and given her nothing except a child and a broken heart. Julian had promised himself he would never make the same mistakes. He would never depend on anyone. He would never let himself need anyone. He would be self-sufficient, self-reliant, untouched. But Dante was different. Dante didn't look at him like prey, didn't treat him like something to be possessed. He looked at Julian like he saw someone worth listening to, someone worth trusting, someone worth protecting not because he was weak, but because he was valuable. It was dangerous. It was so dangerous. Julian closed his eyes and tried to stop thinking. The next morning, Julian arrived at the office to find chaos. The building was buzzing with rumors. Marco had been suspended pending investigation. Dante had called an emergency meeting of all department heads. Employees were whispering in corners, trying to piece together what had happened. The air was thick with tension, with fear, with the scent of uncertainty. Julian walked through the lobby with his head held high, ignoring the stares. He'd made himself look as professional as possible, a tailored suit in charcoal gray, his hair swept back from his face, his scent carefully neutralized with suppressant patches. No one would see him as an Omega. Not today. The emergency board meeting began at 9. Dante sat at the head of the table, his presence filling the room. His scent was controlled, carefully banked, but Julian could detect the embers of anger beneath the surface. The board members sat in uneasy silence, waiting for him to speak. Marco was there too, suspended, but still present, still fighting. The investigation into unauthorized orders, Dante said, his voice calm and measured, has uncovered a pattern of fraud and manipulation. Orders were issued under my signature when I was physically elsewhere. Contracts were redirected to shell companies controlled by members of this organization. Employees were terminated without cause, their benefits canceled without my approval. He paused, letting the words sink in. Marco Vitali, Dante continued, has been identified as the primary source of these fraudulent orders. Marco stood. This is ridiculous. You're letting an Omega with a vendetta destroy 18 years of loyalty. He's feeding you lies because I saw through him. Because I refused to let him manipulate you. Because I refused to let him use his biology to control you. I'm letting evidence speak for itself. Marco laughed. Evidence. He corrected himself, he planted it. You know how manipulative Omegas can be. They sent their way into positions of trust and... Stop. The word came from Dante like a whip crack. His scent flared, aggressive, dangerous, the full weight of an alpha's fury pressing down on the room. The board members flinched. Even the hardened capos looked away. You will not speak about Julian that way in my presence, Dante said. He has proven himself more competent and more loyal than anyone at this table. He uncovered a fraud that you orchestrated. He protected employees you tried to destroy. And he did it without using his biology as leverage, because Julian is smarter than you'll ever be. Marco's face went white. Julian, Dante said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. Would you present the evidence? Julian stood. His heart was racing, but he kept his hands steady. He walked to the front of the room and laid out the folders he'd prepared, the access logs, the timestamps, the financial records, the witness statements. Each piece of evidence was meticulously organized, cross-referenced, annotated. He'd spent hours on this, making sure there were no gaps, no uncertainties. The evidence was bulletproof. Every fraudulent order originated from Marco's terminal, Julian said. I cross-referenced each order against Dante's calendar and location records. There were 37 unauthorized instructions issued over the past year. Together, they redirected approximately $9 million to shell companies controlled by Marco and his associates. He opened the final folder. This is the vendor trail. 3 transport companies receiving inflated contracts share the same legal address. Their profits moved through a private trust controlled by Marco. The same trust that has been funding a lifestyle far beyond Marco's official salary. The room was silent. 9 million, someone whispered. 9 million, Julian confirmed. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The unauthorized terminations alone represent hundreds of thousands in lost wages and benefits. Employees who were fired without cause, without severance, without any explanation. Employees who had worked for the Rossi organization for decades. Some of them were here when Dante's father was still running things. Marco's hands were shaking. This is fabricated. I have records. You have nothing, Dante said quietly. You had 18 years, Marco. 18 years of trust. And you threw it away because you thought I was weak. Because you were weak. Marco's voice cracked. After Enzo died, you were useless. You couldn't make a decision to save your life. I kept the organization running. I kept everyone safe. And this is the thanks I get. You kept yourself rich, Dante said. You kept yourself powerful. You used my grief as a doorway into my empire. Marco's eyes flicked to Julian. And now you're letting an Omega make decisions for you. What do you think Enzo would say about that, huh? What do you think he'd think of you bending over backwards for some pretty secretary with an agenda? He'd be disgusted. He'd be ashamed. Dante moved faster than Julian could track. One moment, Dante was across the room. The next, he had Marco pinned against the wall, his hand around the older man's throat. His scent was overwhelming. Dark cedar and fire, pure alpha dominance. His eyes were blazing, his grip steady, his voice low and dangerous. Enzo, Dante said, his voice barely above a whisper, would have laughed his head off at you. He would have mocked you to your face for being so pathetic that you had to steal from a grieving man. And then he would have killed you for touching the people I care about. Marco choked. You're a monster. No, Dante said. I'm a man who finally remembered what he's capable of. He released Marco and stepped back. Security will escort you out, Dante said. You'll be charged with fraud, conspiracy, and theft. I trust the legal system to handle the rest. I'll destroy you, Marco spat. I'll tell everyone about your little Omega. About how you're so desperate for comfort that you're letting him. Tell everyone, Dante said coolly. I'm not ashamed of Julian. I'm ashamed I didn't see you clearly sooner. And I'm ashamed I let you use my grief to hurt the people I'm supposed to protect. Marco was let out, still shouting threats. The room emptied. Julian stood alone with Dante, his heart pounding. The confrontation had been brutal. Dante had been brutal. And yet, Julian couldn't help noticing the way Dante's hands were still shaking. The way his scent was still unsettled. Anger and grief, and something softer, all tangled together. Are you okay? Julian asked. Dante laughed. It was a broken sound, nothing like the warm laughter from before. I just almost killed a man in front of a room full of people. And I'm supposed to be the one asking you that. You didn't kill him. I wanted to. I know. Dante looked at him. Really looked. You're not afraid of me. No, Julian said. I'm not. Dante moved closer. His scent was overwhelming this close. All that raw alpha power undercut by something almost vulnerable. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I've spent 11 years pushing everyone away. And now you. Now I'm here, Julian said softly. And I'm not going anywhere. Dante's hand came up to cup Julian's face. It was gentle, so gentle. The touch of a man who had forgotten how to be tender and was rediscovering it piece by piece. His thumb traced Julian's cheekbone, featherlight. May I? Dante started. Yes, Julian said. Yes. Dante kissed him. It was soft at first, tender, like Dante was testing the waters, making sure Julian was really there, really willing. His lips were warm against Julian's, hesitant and careful. But then Julian made a small sound of approval, and something in Dante shifted. The kiss deepened. Dante's arms came around Julian, pulling him close. His scent surrounded Julian, warm and safe and possessive in a way that should have been alarming but wasn't. Julian felt himself melting into the embrace, his defenses crumbling. When Dante finally pulled back, he was breathing hard. Is this, he stopped, swallowed. Is this okay? Julian laughed. You just put a man against a wall for me. I think it's more than okay. Dante's eyes softened. I've been doing this wrong for so long, he said. I was so afraid that if I let myself feel anything, if I let anyone close, I'd be betraying Enzo. But he wouldn't have wanted that. He would have wanted me to live. He would have wanted me to find someone. I think he'd be happy for you, Julian said quietly. I think he'd be relieved that you're finally letting yourself laugh again. I think he'd be grateful that someone finally reminded you how. Dante kissed him again. A promise this time. A beginning. Outside the window, the rain had finally stopped. Sunlight was breaking through the clouds, warm and golden and full of possibility. The storm was over. Something new was beginning. Julian leaned into Dante's embrace and let himself hope. 3 months later, the Rossi organization had changed. Dante had replaced the old leadership structure with written approvals, independent audits, and direct employee access to executive decisions. He no longer believed fear was proof of loyalty. The board meetings were different now. People spoke up, asked questions, offered opinions. The fear that had once choked the organization was slowly being replaced by trust. Marco's trial was ongoing, but the evidence against him was so overwhelming that even his lawyers had stopped trying. The $9 million he'd stolen was being recovered. The employees he'd fired were being reinstated. The benefits he'd canceled were being restored. The organization was healing. Julian's temporary operations role had ended when the investigation closed. The board had then advertised a permanent senior operations position. Julian had applied like every other candidate, presenting the system he'd created for verifying orders and protecting employees. He'd earned the position unanimously. Dante hadn't voted. He'd wanted no one claiming Julian received it because they were, what? Involved? Something more than involved? He wanted Julian's success to be his own, not a gift from his boyfriend. Julian wasn't sure what to call what they had. It was more than a workplace relationship, more than a casual affair. But it was also new, fragile, still finding its shape. They were taking it slow. Dante had been alone for so long that he didn't know how to be with someone. Julian had been so guarded for so long that he didn't know how to be open. They were learning together, growing together, becoming something new. The memorial service for Enzo was different this year. In previous years, Dante had stood beside the photograph, spoken 2 formal sentences, and left before anyone could mention how Enzo had lived. The service had been a formality, a duty, a performance he performed for the organization's sake. This year, everything was different. This time, he carried a ridiculous framed certificate from Enzo's old office, Chief Director of Unnecessary Opinions. Dante told the employees that Enzo once interrupted a major meeting to declare that the conference table was too serious to be trusted. A few people smiled carefully, uncertain. Then Dante admitted that Enzo had blamed the table after losing an argument. The table, he claimed, had been smug about it. Julian laughed first. Dante followed. The sound was no longer shocked out of him. He chose it. He embraced it. Soon, the entire room was laughing with him rather than freezing in fear. The laughter spread, warm and unexpected, filling the space where grief had lived for so long. It was healing. Dante looked toward Enzo's photograph and understood that happiness didn't erase grief. It gave memory somewhere warm to live. His brother was still gone, still missed, still loved. But the pain no longer owned him. He was free. Later that evening, Julian entered Dante's office and found his chair empty. He sat in it. When Dante appeared in the doorway, Julian lowered his voice dramatically. The quarterly report is 2 pages longer than expected. Clearly, the finance department has declared war. I suspect the paperclip industry is behind it. They've been suspiciously quiet lately. Dante crossed his arms, his lips twitching. Are you mocking me again? No. I'm checking whether the chair has developed better leadership skills. It seems to have improved. Dante laughed. This time, no one outside the office stopped working. The sound had finally become part of the building, woven into its fabric like the scent of coffee or the hum of computers. Dante walked toward the desk and took Julian's hand. Dinner, he asked. With me? Is this an executive instruction? A personal request. And if I refuse? I'll pretend the chair advised against it. Julian looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled. One of the real ones, the ones he kept hidden from everyone except Dante. Yes, he said. I'd love to. Dante offered his hand as Julian stood. 11 years earlier, Marco had taken Enzo's life and convinced Dante that laughter belonged to the dead. 11 years of silence, of isolation, of punishing himself for surviving. 11 years of believing that happiness was a betrayal. Julian had never replaced Enzo or repaired Dante's grief. He'd simply refused to let pain speak with Dante's voice forever. He'd reminded him that the dead don't want the living to stop living. That love doesn't end when someone dies. That laughter isn't a betrayal. It's a continuation. A celebration. A way of keeping the dead alive in memory. The Don who once terrified an entire empire with silence finally discovered that being heard wasn't the same as being feared. That trust was stronger than fear. That love could exist alongside grief. Sometimes, it began with one impossible secretary sitting in the wrong chair and reminding him how to laugh again. And sometimes, it became something even more beautiful. 2 people, broken by the world, finding wholeness in each other. As Dante led Julian out of the office, their hands intertwined. The building buzzed with a new energy. People smiled at each other in the hallways. They spoke openly, without fear. The silence that had once choked the Rossi organization was gone, replaced by something warmer. Something better. Something alive. Dante looked at Julian, his secretary, his partner, the Omega who had changed everything. Thank you, he said quietly. For everything. Julian squeezed his hand. Thank you for letting me. For trusting me. For seeing me. They walked out into the evening together, the city lights glittering around them, the future opening up like a path through the darkness. Behind them, the Rossi organization was finding its footing again. Ahead of them, a life full of possibility. The story was just beginning.